Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Educate and Empower Addressing the Gender Pay Gap digital event hosted by the CMI North East Yorkshire and Humberside Regional Board. My name is Natasha and I'm an events coordinator at CMI, and I'll shortly be handing over to Sarah to begin today's event. If you have any questions during the digital event, you can ask them using the live chat box to the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can during the Q&A. Today's session is being recorded and will be available for anyone who books to attend. The event recording will also be on the CMI website and the CMI YouTube channel. Now over to Sarah, EDI lead of the NEYH Regional Board, to begin the event.
Thank you, Natasha. Good evening, everybody. I'm Sarah Salahuddin, and I'm the Diversity and Inclusion Lead for the North East Yorkshire and Humberside CMI Board. I am absolutely excited for this event because I think it is a topic that is close to my heart, but it is also a topic that has gained a lot of focus and raised awareness in the last few years. So in 2017, there was a requirement that any organization with more than 250 colleagues and employees needed to report on the gender pay gap. And I think it's important. It's an important way to empower women and to create that equality as well. You'll recall that last year's International Women's Day theme was Choose to Challenge. And this is almost linking to that on how we choose to challenge, how we embrace the challenge, and how we can share some of the lessons and benefits, and what can we learn from what businesses have done, what can we learn from some of the research that's being done. So without further delay, I'm going to introduce the panel to all of you. We've got three very interesting panelists and very qualified. So we've got Dr. Penny Take from the University of Sheffield, who's an organizational psychologist, and she was also working as an occupational psychologist, which stems her interest in the research that she has conducted. So Penny's going to talk to us about that. And then we have Natalie Doherty from the Source Skills. She's Director of Quality, Curriculum and Innovation, and she works with further education, and she started as a dancer. But, her experience is very enlightening and how she has empowered herself. So she's going to share some of that insight. And our third speaker, which is very pertinent and important that we hear from business leaders, is from Yorkshire Building Society, Tracy Newton. And she's the Director of Colleague Experience. Tracy has a broad remit, which has diversity and inclusion as one part, and talent development as well. So I'm going to start with Penny to share some of her insights and some of the research in terms of the gender pay gap and what she has learned and found and the importance of it. So if I could hand over to Penny.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, everybody. Could I have the first slide up, actually, because I think that's the last one that's currently on the screen. Thanks. So it's lovely to be able to see you all here tonight and to talk to you in a very brief presentation about some insights that I've developed over the years, and also more recently from a recently funded project that I completed into women's careers. I work at Sheffield University Management School, and I've been there for 20 years, and I've had this research interest since the start of my academic career, which is too long ago for me to want to mention now. Could I have the next slide, please? So the gender pay gap, I mean, I know that I'm probably speaking, to you all, and you're all very aware of this, but, it's quite a contentious idea, actually, because if you do a Google search on it, you'll find papers that say that it's a bit of a myth and it doesn't really exist, which I don't agree with. But, people are allowed to contest ideas. But we, one report that I saw in The Guardian last month was that in the UK, women's median hourly pay rate on average is 10.2% less than men's, which compares with 9.3% in 2018. So the problem seems to be increasing, not decreasing, which is really a little bit depressing. So if we accept there's a pay gap, then we need to understand why that's there. Could I have the next slide, please? So what are the explanations put forward about it? Again, you may have heard about this, but the first 2 points in this slide really come together as a package. And one of the reasons is that the senior roles and professional roles in particular that women occupy tend to be undervalued compared to the senior and professional roles that men occupy. And what this means is that women's qualifications, although they are ostensibly the same, tend to be undervalued in general. And so they start off from, university being at a disadvantage because they're generally not in the main doing subjects that are counted as being particularly important. And I'm thinking there about STEM in particular science, technology, engineering and maths. I mean, they have a real problem attracting women. But that's one of the reasons. So women's qualifications aren't valued as much as men. And they tend to end up in occupations and professions which are seen to be typical of women. So if you take our own human resource management course at Sheffield, for example, at the university, our master's degree, it's 90% women take that course, 10% men. And that's because HRM, as some of you will know, we're in HRM, is not the most valued profession within an organisation. We could argue till the sky is grey about why that's the case, but it is. So that's one explanation. It's qualifications linked to sex segregation, the types of roles to which women are attracted and apply. Another major issue is that women tend to take time out for maternity leave and child raising. And the argument there is, well, they've not been in the job and so they haven't acquired the portfolio of skills and experiences that are actually needed to enable career progression. Again, we could dispute that, but that's one of the explanations put forward. And then another major issue is the fact that a lot of women, once they do have children, tend to work part-time. And part-time work just does not pay as well as full-time work. So there's some of the reasons why the pay gap exists. So if I could have the next slide, please, that would be great. So obviously, the important issue for organisations is how do we address this pay gap? And a lot of the solutions that have been put forward in the academic literature are based on the idea that flexible working, if it's done properly, will enable women to better manage the demands of home and work. And yet we know from research that that doesn't seem to be working very well. One of the things that I did recently, which I mentioned at the start, is I completed a funded study into women's careers. And that was a qualitative study that involved life history interviews, basically asking people about their lives and their work lives with 27 women. And the data from my study suggests some things going on that's a bit more complex than this. So I'm going to very quickly run through some of the findings that I think are relevant to us understanding the gender pay gap. So I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so the first thing that I think we need to understand a lot better is what do women actually want from their careers? Because I think one of the assumptions that's often made in the literature is that women are striving for higher status, higher paid roles. But actually, the women in my study said that that wasn't necessarily true for them. They actually wanted to do meaningful work and they wanted to be recognised for what they actually delivered. But was that always climbing up the greasy pole? Not necessarily. The women in my study expressed ambition for their life, and that included work, but it wasn't just about work. They want their lives to be well-rounded and fulfilling in everything that they do. Another issue is that with regards to flexible working, the support from managers in a lot of organisations is simply not there. And there is an imperative in a lot of jobs that it requires a full-time commitment, which obviously a lot of women, once they have children, simply cannot provide that commitment, and yet it never gets interrogated. Why does this job require a full-time commitment? And the final finding that I think is relevant is the fact that these career expectations for women that are put about in the press and the media and social media, that we should be striving ever onwards and upwards. were actually experienced by several of the women in my study as oppressive and depressing. So they were saying things like, I'm 29 and I know I'm not as far on as I should be, you know, given what I'm reading in the paper, but actually I'm quite happy, but I feel as if I'm failing. So this idea that we should be striving isn't necessarily experienced as helpful. It can be oppressive and depressing. Next slide, please. So I think some issues that for me that we need to consider when we're thinking about the gender pay gap are these four. One of the things is that current reward systems are far too focused on the bottom line mentality. So in other words, we tend to want to promote and reward people who are doing things that the organisation considers very important, which is ostensibly making profit or, you know, enabling the organisation to meet its goals very efficiently. However, the bottom line isn't the only thing. You know, how do we get there? How do we actually do that? And a lot of the time, the women I spoke to said, I do a lot of stuff that's important for the achievement of the bottom line, but it's not recognised because it's not quantifiable and it's not measurable. I'm doing a lot of support. I'm doing a lot of emotional labour. I'm doing a lot of stuff that we just don't value because it's not very obvious and it's not seen and it's not measurable. Another thing is that there are lack of role models. Depressingly, a few of the younger women I spoke to said, I used to want to get very high in my career and try and earn a lot of money, but looking at the people who do make it, I've changed my mind. That is not the person I want to be. And we haven't got enough role models in organisations actually modelling alternative ways of being good at your job and being effective at your job and doing meaningful work. There's too much emphasis on upward mobility currently. That is not, and certainly with the women that I interviewed, upward mobility is not an issue. It's actually been rewarded and recognised for what you do. Status isn't necessarily that important, especially if you've got other things that you value as much in your life. And as I've already mentioned, another really big issue is the fact that there's too much inertia with respect to long hours cultures. There's just an expectation that if you're a manager, you've got to do 50 plus hours a week with zero interrogation of why that's actually important, especially because we know, and I'm a psychologist and I've done some work into this in the past, is that actually people can't be productive for that long when they're working long hours. It's just not possible. We haven't got the stamina psychologically or physically to do it. So that is what I want to present. It's been very brief, but I hope I've stuck to my time. And I'll hand back to Sarah.
Thanks, Penny. That is really interesting, and I hope that our listeners will find it very insightful as well. I think there's just a couple of things that I noted down while you were talking through it, and there is that occupational divide, which could probably lead to some of the challenges around the gender pay gap. But also, do you feel from what I've listened to that it is listening to the colleagues? There's more that the businesses and managers and leaders need to do in terms of listening to what the female colleagues want and how they feel rewarded. Is that something that you would say is one of the key findings?
Yeah, I think it's about support. So the women in my study felt very happy with their lot, both in terms of how they were recognised and rewarded, had hugely supportive managers who would sit down with them and have conversations about what can we do to keep you in this organisation and make sure you don't go, because we really value you. And too few people, and it depresses me to say this, hear that message from the managers. They feel as if they're treated like an interchangeable commodity. You don't like it, go. Well, that's not the attitude we should be having towards our staff, I'm afraid, in the 21st century. It's just not good enough.
No, absolutely not. And this is where, when we come later in the section of this session to talk to Tracy about what organizations can do. But at this point, thank you for sharing the findings. At this point, I'm going to invite Natalie to talk to us, because Natalie, you do a lot of work with young adults and people who are starting out on apprenticeships or who've come from underprivileged backgrounds. And, it's probably the journey that they're going to and what they will face maybe in a few years. What has your experience been in terms of in our region and working with the young adults and females particularly?
I think in terms of my experience of working with young adults, by the time they reach me at 16, this preconceived idea of what a male and a female should be doing is well set. So my personal belief is that this gender pay gap conversation needs to happen a lot earlier and around primary age, and what we aspire our primary age students to be. So through that initial advice and guidance and careers advice, the way that we actually disguise it to primary schools, that it's fun, it's interactive, but you're actually opening a completely different world to young people. So as I said, by the time of 16, they're coming to me. So the majority of female learners want to do apprenticeships in customer service, business admin, the traditional roles that you would expect. And we find a lot of the males will come and do warehousing, logistics, some of the more physical, more manual standards. And then it gets really interesting when we get to like leadership and management, because a lot of them trainees are the apprentices are not actually new apprentices. They're normally upskills in businesses. And there is a lot of emphasis on males getting upskilled in a business and moved up that ladder. So very much what Dr. Penny said is, you know, it's kind of you're pushing them males to live to that aspiration. And you know, a female has got all this other stuff that's going on. However, in my own personal experience, I kind of took that image quite early on through role models that I had. So my mum was very successful, my dad was very successful. I wanted to be a dancer. It wasn't really seen as, you know, the best career. You know, but you know, you were female. It was very competitive for females, and I realised there really quickly that there was that gender imbalance, obviously, with male dancers. However, male dancers were getting paid more than female dancers, which then raised more questions. So, you know, I've gone through that career, and I've kind of took on board the ability to empower myself and learn from strong female role models. So, as I said, when I was younger, I had strong female role models within my family, which was my mum. Both my nans were really strong, supported families. The family ethos and models were really deep rooted, and it was about aspiring and being the best that you could be, no matter who you were. And I've kind of used that as my motivation working with young people, being a tutor in FE colleges all the way through to obviously my role now, and use that to inspire young people, whether they're male or female, to aspire to be what they want to be, not what somebody tells you you need to be and what that tag is, but also at the same time to be able to gather the tools that they need and the confidence to sit down and have them conversations. So, you know, I tell people a lot of the times, especially young people, when I go for a job, I'm going for an interview, I know what the job is. I know what the salary range will be. However, I also know what I'm worth. And it's them type of conversations and negotiations that I find young people, and especially females, do not have the confidence to say, you know, it may not necessarily be the highest salary that you're after. You may be after a few more days holiday, which actually is more value to you than actually having another $3,000 on the salary. So it's about the benefits package and looking at that whole package in terms of what is wanted.
And I think that's such an important point. It goes back to understanding what the colleague or what the employee feels rewarded with and what motivates them. I think, Natalie, from in your experience, you've also worked with people who've come out of the prison.
Yes.
And you know, you've worked intensely. So what have you observed there, and what are some of the things that you employ there that could help people to feel empowered generally? What are the tips that we could give them?
So my work in prison was with male offenders from the age of 18 right the way through to adult males, and the majority had quite severe cases, which did limit the work possibilities for them. And in a way, working in the prison, it kind of showed me that it's very much like a female's experience, because there was so many limitations put on these men that they kind of were entering an environment where they were in a way of saying, I guess, that they were on an even keel, because they actually then felt the restrictions. However, being in that environment, it was really interesting because I was the head of education. I had a lot of female staff within that environment, which was the nature and the understanding, being able to work with the offenders and to get the offenders to do what they wanted them to do. And you could see a definite change in the behaviour. If a male tutor came in, there was a lot more conflict, but not physical conflict, but more verbal conflict. And I think you see that in the workplace between males trying to outdo each other to get up the ladder, to that competition, whereas females within, and I'm not saying, I know I sound really generalised, don't I? Say everyone's like this, but females are more inclined to work together, to work collaboratively for the greater good, rather than think about themselves and what their next step is.
And I guess that's where the benefit is of the representation and the role models, and the role that the role models can actually play, which I think is consistent theme across what Penny has said, what you are saying. One of the things which, because you work with the young adults and apprenticeships, is around feeling, empowered and not being afraid. And I think the point that you make about starting at an early age and not compartmentalizing occupations, because it seems to perpetuate and then lead into the gap that we're starting to see. What do you think individuals could take away or reflect on, and how they address this, and how you mentioned slightly about what I am worth, which I think is a really good point. Don't be shy, you know what you're worth. Could you elaborate on that a bit, Natalie, please?
Yeah, so I guess I developed that skill through being a dancer. Obviously, I put myself on stage to be judged, to be criticised on a daily basis. And teaching in that field early on in my career, we used to teach resilience. That's what we were teaching. We weren't teaching a dance technique. We weren't teaching performing art. We were teaching how to combat being told no, because a lot of the industry is about obviously doing auditions and getting knocked back, and you go to another audition and you get told no. And I think to build that into young people is key. That no doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It means not now with that company, but that no could be the yes from somewhere else. And for me, it's very important that individuals align their morals and their beliefs with a company, because if your morals aren't in line with that company, then straight away the person that's interviewing you potentially, or who's at the head of that organization, you're not seeing eye to eye at all. So to have that challenging conversation, if you're sitting at interview, is going to be really difficult, because you've got to find that ground, that the distance between you, and try and flip your mindset within a matter of seconds to think like that organization does. And I think that's why I believe it's about the whole package, not just about the salary. A lot of people say to me, do you enjoy what you do? I bet you get paid loads of money. No, I don't get paid loads of money. My rewards come from what my learners achieve. And whether it was, £200,000 a year or £20,000 a year, I will gain that same reward and that same, I guess, gratification from the work that I do, really.
And I think that's a really important point, because at this, that the values resonate. I think that's a key thing, to understand who you're working for and working with, because otherwise you can't really have that conversation and be able to communicate. But I really like the resilience point. I think the pandemic, if there is one thing that it has taught us, is the necessity of being resilient, and it's so important. And I guess, in the performing arts, like you say, it's not necessarily following a procedure, but it's the resilience going in front day in, day out. And that's so important that we ensure that at a young age. But also, I guess, Tracy, if I come to you now from an organizational perspective, that some of the challenges that you've heard, the findings from Penny's research, and experiences from Natalie, what do you think, and what has your experience been at YBS? So with the whole gender pay gap reporting when it started, if you could give us a brief overview first, and then if we can delve into it a bit.
The YBS approach and journey, coming back to some of the things that Penny and Natalie have said, both of you have talked about role models, both of you have talked about opportunity, both of you have talked about individuals seeing people being themselves, and I think that actually is one of the most important things that you can do in an organisation to help females feel there's optionality. But I can talk a little bit more about that as we kind of walk through what we've done at YBS. So at YBS, you mentioned, Sarah, that there was a regulatory requirement to start reporting gender pay in 2017. Now, we used to, in advance of that, we used to do an equal pay check as part of our annual pay review each year. So in terms of kind of having an awareness of that, I think there was an element of it. However, what that did do was more from a legality, two people, similar roles, similar piece, were they being paid differently? And we didn't see anything significantly coming through. What I would say is that the gender pay gap reporting, because it operates in a different format, helped us to see some other challenges that were happening in the organisation. So data has been a really good indicator for us in terms of spurring off action. So obviously the reporting came in 2017. In advance of doing that, bit of background on YBS, we're a 3,000 people organisation. We're national reach in terms of the branches that we have. Our makeup of colleagues is actually really weighted towards females. So we've got between 65 and 70% female, rest are male. And that kind of gives you a sense of our makeup. First things that we did in advance of the reporting was try and understand our baseline. So we did some work where we looked at our policy and our policy in terms of pay, looking at language, the pay mechanisms, the advice that we gave to leaders, and we didn't find any particular challenges in that. We were relatively comfortable. And then we also started to review our pay practice, and we did an initial run at the pay gap reporting. What that did show us was actually there was a gap, and there was a reasonably chunky gap. It was in the 30+%. And that was a surprise if you start thinking about the fact that we looked at kind of roll on roll reporting and there hadn't been a particular issue. Now, what that did do was give us some signals to start to have a look at what was driving it, and to really help us start to kind of get into the root cause. We discovered that in our terms of our reward practice, when you came to things like annual pay reviews and processes, there was no particular gender bias, but there was when it started to come to recruitment. And I think one of the other ladies mentioned about that whole notion of negotiation, knowing what you're worth. The male and female approach is quite different. So what you would see was that you would have a male and a female come into the workplace, similar role, but they would come at different points in the pay range. And typically females were coming in lower. And I think part of that was they weren't negotiating themselves up. What you then saw was if our annual pay practice pay review came along, and that was quite formulaic, they were starting at a lower base, so they couldn't match up. So we started to see where there were some challenges. Also, when we really started to get underneath the detail of the data, we got a real sense of our root cause. And our root cause was very much about representation. So we have more senior men in more junior, we have more senior men more men in senior roles and more females in junior roles. So back to what I talked about, we've got this weighting of 60% to 30% male female, but you could see the concentration. So that was quite an interesting route for us to start to understand what was the impact that was having. We did do some additional analysis where we equalised pay. So we did a piece that said, well, actually, if you equalised representation at each organisational layer, what was the gap then? And it was more like 4%. So it really was about concentration of populations. We even did a piece where we looked at if we were to equalise, if we had to get a 50-50 representation at our senior level for females, the gap was still around 20% because of how few males were at the lower end of the organisation. So I think what the data did for us was it helped us identify where to take some action. And there's a number of things that we did, and I'll kind of give you a bit of a headline around that. We did some work around actually how did we get more males into entry-level roles, so we could actually really reshape that makeup at that level, also meant that we could more overtly reflect our customer, because our customers are not all female. So how could we get some more males in there? We looked at our advertising processes. We looked at the interview processes. We looked at the language in adverts. We looked at the job titles that we had and started to really reshape our attraction mechanisms. At a more senior level, in terms of females, we really started to tackle our talent pipeline. And that was really looking at talent on a basis of what was really bringing gender into that. So what was the weighting? And at the starting point, it was really heavily biased towards men. So actually, we started to do more work to identify the potential that we had at that level, think about how we could support and sponsor more females, so we could start to really change the shape of that senior population. We also did some work to start to understand where did the issues often arise. So we have this really heavy weighted females at the junior end, but they were not making their way up through the organisation. And we saw that typically it was at our team leader type level that females would almost check out, and they would come out of that process in terms of progression. And we started to have a look at, so help us understand what some of those challenges might be. Some of it was our maternity benefits were statutory, they were not great. So often we would find women would get to that level and they would leave the organisation to start a family and progress because they felt they couldn't do it with us. So we took action there to reshape that and to reshape the benefits in that place to help people to start to feel that they could move on. We did a chunk of work around pay education with leaders around setting salaries at the outset. So whilst the female might not negotiate up, we didn't want to feel like they had to. So how could we really think about that in our decision making? And we put a chunk of work in terms of our pay review process each year. So part of the decision making criteria for a leader was looking at gender imbalance across their team so that they could overtly take action to right it. We also did some other pieces which was about showing intent and actually communicating with our colleagues. So we shared data to say our pay gap's not where it wants to be. It's driven by representation, and we really want to take action in this space. So we signed the Women in Finance Charter in 2018. We said that we wanted to get to a point where we would be 50-50 male-female at our senior manager plus level by 2023. We hit that in 2021. We said where we wanted to go, we showed the intent, and we tracked our progress against it. We looked at things like, and it's interesting that one of the ladies mentioned about flexible working. Now, I recognise there's a piece which is about managing the load across both male and females, but we introduced flexible working and really started to think about being a working parents-friendly organisation, but that worked for both male and female. So we changed our approach to that. So we've got more females that are working flexibly, but we have more males that are doing it too, and we champion that. And that's about enabling them to work in a way that works for them, but it also means that home burden isn't always with the female. And we did a chunk of work around role modelling. So we really started to really up the ante in terms of our communication about where we wanted to be, what our challenges were, and we really started to share career stories so colleagues could see what the opportunity might be, and they could see women that had moved through the organisation. But we also shared stories about some females' terrible experiences. So as part of our gender pay report in 1 year, we shared that internally, and we shared a whole load of female stories about actually what stops them, what gets in the way, what their experience has been at YBS, so we could uncover them, face into them, and think about how we might do things differently. Because one thing we wanted to be was really authentic to the female's experience. And we've done other things, like we've introduced mentoring circles. So we've got females coming together, sharing experiences and challenges. We've done a whole load of work with our male leaders to create allies and advocates so they can understand some of the female experience. And we've put in place colleague networks. And all of those things have started to really raise awareness in the organisation about experiences that individuals work through, and to start helping others, support others to really raise up what the opportunities are. Where we are now, we've seen the gender pay gap reduce. It's not where we want it to be, but it has reduced. We've seen our representation shift. We've got more males in junior roles. Our talent pipeline is at 50-50. We've hit our Women in Finance ambition early. But the key thing that we've done is, in years gone by, we've gone out and told colleagues that's where we want to get to. We've been honest about where we are, where we want to go, the steps that we're taking, and we're measuring that progress and success, and we're continually talking about it. So I think, in summary, from a YBS perspective, the data really helped us lean into the conversation. I think we thought that we were doing some of this stuff well. The data showed us where our gaps were, and it helped us really see where we could take action, and it really helped us measure that progress. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of how we've used it, what we've done with it, and how that's driven forward some of the activity that we've done in YBS.
Absolutely, and it's quite interesting to hear from an organization's perspective, of course. I know YBS is a, national, you have national presence, but the reason for inviting you was, of course, because you have a large workforce in the Yorkshire region, which is very key, because it's important to understand what some of the challenges are regionally as well, because sometimes what happens is that with a national organization as well, some of the more senior roles can be distributed nationally, and that can create its own challenges. I think you've talked about, lots of things in terms of that you've tried to look at as an organization, some of the action plans you've got. But what I wanted to understand is, you said you've shared with the employees. How have employees actually responded? Do they believe in it? Are they, coming along with the journey? Have you seen a lot of movement internally of the talent?
I think colleagues do believe it, but I think they have to see sustained effort and change. And the biggest thing that we did was be really honest about our starting point and where we wanted to be. We've definitely seen a shift in terms of female talent identification, more females moving around the organisation, and certainly at that senior level, to be at 50-50 when I think we started at 36% were female, to make a 14% shift in what in essence was 3 years has been pretty impressive for us, and we were really proud of that. So we can see that shift. I think the biggest thing that we've got is through the colleague network, through the role modelling, through the sharing stories. Colleagues are talking about this. They're talking about it. They're challenging us on it. If we have town halls talking to colleagues, these are the things that they raise. So they're holding us to account, which is what we needed. And I think because they can see action taking place, they're working with us. I think regionally we're interesting. So our head offices are in Leeds and Bradford. We out in the network where we're kind of more distributed, there are fewer opportunities to move through that hierarchy in the organisation, simply because there's fewer roles there. But what we have done is we've made concerted effort around how we operate, how we recruit, the skills that we're looking for to open up opportunities and really create those role models. In the last 18 months, I think we've promoted 4 females internally to move into director level. People are seeing it happen, and I think that's the bit that's keeping the momentum. But our colleagues are definitely holding us to account to it.
Yeah, that's good to hear, because, absolutely, I think having the action plans and seeing the result is very important. But at the same time, sometimes the challenge with having a target is that the target can be met of certain, females in senior roles, but the internal talent can be marginalized or not feel involved. And that's a key responsibility that the business needs to own to make sure that they're brought on the journey. I guess to conclude from your presentation, the chat we've had, Tracy, is that the data is not just the data, of course. It's, yes, you have to report on the gender pay gap. It's when you've dug deeper on the data and the insights you have found, and how then translating each of those insights to actionable points, basically. So that you can get some benefits and result. Thank you very much for sharing that. I'm going to ask Penny and Natalie just for their thoughts on this. If I may go to Penny first, in terms of, you've done some of the research with females, and what you've heard from Tracy today in terms of what actions the business is trying to take? Do you think that goes in some way to addressing?
I think what Tracy said is really important. I think that, you know, organisations need to actually find ways to be more transparent about what's going on. And it is very uncomfortable. And there are issues around confidentiality and so on that does make it tricky. But it doesn't mean to say you can't try. And I think, you know, what Tracy was saying is really a very good case study in this. You know, look at your data, look at what it's telling you. Where are the specific problems? Because one of the issues that you have for an academic like myself trying to present on topics like the gender pay gap is we're not talking about a homogeneous lump of stuff going on. It varies from organisation to organisation, from industrial context to industrial context, from job level to job level and profession to profession. And because of that complexity, we need more organisations doing what YBS are doing and what Tracy's told us about, which is using your own data to go, this is where we've got our problems and this is what we're aiming to do. And I think opening a communication line with your employees and showing that you're bothered is a massive start point. Even if you end up saying, you know, at the moment, there isn't a great deal that we can see we can do, but we know what's going on. We know where your anger is coming from. I think that's, for me, that's massive.
Thank you, Penny. I think, yes, absolutely. It is massive. Natalie, I'll come to you now. In terms of what you've heard from Tracy and whether you think, you know, how that can help empower the females.
I mean, I totally agree with everything that Tracy and her team are doing. For me, it's if you want equality, you have to think about individuals and what them individuals need. And for other organisations to start looking at it collectively and very generic that, you know, we'll do X and that will solve Y problem. No, it won't, because X has many factors in it. So you need to have that dialogue with your staff to identify what your staff need, what would make them feel more appreciated and valued within the business, and then build your model based on that feedback. Because that's your collective audience, and obviously for a business, your staff are your best selling point, really, to get other staff in and, you know, to share the good values of the organisation. So I think it's key to get to the grassroots level of each individual in there and where they believe that things can be improved in relation to their own circumstance, which then takes a kind of away that conversation where we've all got to start talking about salaries, which is the uncomfortable conversation. People are talking about themselves with their line manager, who already knows how much the salary is anyway, so they can literally spout off what their ideal job would look like in terms of what their needs are. And I think that way you'll start to realise that actually some want pay, some want holidays, some want flexible working, some want other stuff, and you match that so that it becomes normal practice when you get to the interview process, that actually these are conversations that we have at interview. So, you know, would you like to do flexible work? What type of, you know, salary you're looking at, holidays? I know you can't just give free rein, obviously, in terms of salary options to people, but to give people that ability to at least think they've been part of that discussion rather than have a label put on them straight away is key.
Yeah, and I'm going to come to that conversation piece again because we've had a few questions submitted around that. But just before I go to the questions, thank you very much. It's been, you know, extremely helpful, and we'll take on the questions now. But one thing that I do want to cover that, Tracy, you alluded to around, you know, role models and the flexible working that you're offering to working parents. And it might, you know, could be broader because people have other caring responsibilities, and those flexible working options are equally important to both males and females. I think in the role modeling space, we need male role models to champion it, because that's so important. That empowers leaders who can empower the females and help them grow, because that's another element of role modeling that is equally needed, because they will then engender that role modeling in female leaders and employees. But I think it's been very insightful, very, very interesting. we're going to now move on to questions. I know we've had questions in the comments as we've been talking. So if we take the first question that we had, Natasha. Which was around the pay challenge, and how do you have the conversation for the salary? You know, there were several examples where people have had are aware that a male peer is being paid more, or there is a change of line manager and they've had the conversation with the previous manager, but it hasn't led to any fruition. How can we address that, and how can we bring it up in conversation? And for that, Natalie, I'm going to come to you first.
Okay. So I think, I mean, I've been in this situation personally myself, and it is very much about knowing your worth and knowing what your job role entails and demonstrating that you can achieve and accomplish what that has done. So obviously going into a new role, I will negotiate with whoever the employer is about what salary I need. At that point, I tend to set myself a set of KPIs that I then share with the business and say, within 6 months, this is what I will achieve for you. And then that becomes a measure for 6 months. When I get to that 6 months, we will have another conversation to say, well, actually, this is what I've done. I actually believe that X, Y, Z. And then we set another set of KPIs. They could be 12 months, 18 months long, but it's always having that conversation and then targets there to prove it's not just a case of saying, you know, because I'm female, I should be paid the same. I honestly believe whether you're male or female, you've got to prove that you can do the job and do it to a high standard. If you do that, that conversation is really easy, because that's understanding, knowing your worth, and your employer knowing your worth. If the conversation is difficult, there's a problem on either side, either your side, that you may not be fully committed to what the work is, or you may not have a clear understanding, or it could be on the employer's side that their expectation for the job role isn't actually what the job role is. So that's the bit you've got to sort out first, the clarity around what the expectation and the aspiration for that job role is. Set your target, set a price, and then move on.
I think that's a really important point, that the problem can be on both sides, only whether that's a lack of confidence, you know, your ability to articulate what the objective is, what you're trying to achieve. And personally, I've been through that challenge, but I had an amazing mentor who said, you believe in it, so go and ask for it. And I think once you overcome that hurdle, like you say, once you've had that conversation, then you are motivated to work towards. And it's not about proving yourself, but that your work will speak and you can kind of demonstrate basically your worth. So that's really important. Tracy, just out of curiosity, have you ever, have you experienced where people, because you alluded to that women don't necessarily negotiate, from a, colleague experience director and managing talent, what would your advice be to someone who wants to have a conversation with their line manager about pay gap?
I think there's two things for me. I mean, I think the pay gap data is really interesting, because I think the fact that you publish it means that prospective talent have a sense of how you operate as an organisation. And I think all businesses need to think about that and the message that sends. So I just think that's one thing that we should really think about with it. At YBS, we do a whole host of pay training, and we do a load of pay training with leaders and colleagues each year to help them think about what are the things that influence pay. And that's around affordability, someone's behaviours, capability. It can be about market rate. And we ask them to think about those things as part of the decision-making process. So that gives colleagues and leaders a really consistent language to have that conversation. The other thing that we do is that we're completely transparent on pay ranges. So if somebody applies for a role, they know the range for their role, they know how we operate, they know the things that come into play. So actually those things should mean that we're giving people the tools to have, and the language to have the conversation, because I think talking about pay is hard for men and women. I think it's one of the most gloriously taboo subjects still. We can talk about mental health, but talking about money is really hard. So I think that's just a very kind of societal thing for us. So what we've focused on doing is giving people the data and giving people the tools to understand the things that influence pay. And then it's back to what Natalie said. You've got to think about what are you worth, where your performance is, those different data points, so you can have a conversation about that and be comfortable about where you're positioned. And yeah, I don't think it's ever easy. I think it's a really uncomfortable thing to do, but the more data you can give someone and the more kind of objectivity in the process, the easier that it comes.
Thank you. And I think it resonates with the point earlier, finding out about the organization, finding out about your employer, even if you are there, or you've been there years, have you looked at the gender pay gap report? Do you understand what's published and available? Penny, would you like to provide any concluding thoughts on this topic before we move on to the next question? Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, we know from decades of research that women are much less likely to ask for stuff, like more pay, and they're not very good at blowing their own trumpet. Like a lot of research shows that women will rule themselves out of applying for a job, automatically assuming they don't have the skill set, in a way that often men don't make that assumption about themselves. So we've already got that kind of, natural proclivity not to want to do that. But I think the points that Natalie and Tracy have made are absolutely critical. I think you've got to kind of set out what your goals are, and you've got to do that against the backdrop of what you know is going on in the organisation. And I think if you can get support from somebody to help you compile your case, because often you're not very good. I mean, I'm not very good at it, and it's not just women, it's men as well, but you're not very good sometimes at just going, oh yeah, I did that and it was really effective and I did really make a difference. So getting somebody to sit down with you and go through, your KPIs and say, this is what you've achieved and this is why you've got a basis for going forwards for this request for a pay rise. I think that's really important. And having somebody to support you will just give you that confidence to go in, rather than feeling, oh, I'm doing this and I don't really believe in myself. You've got to have the support, I think.
Okay, thank you.
So we're going to switch to an audience question now. We are running out of time quickly and we want to get as many answers as we can for these. So according to PwC's Women and Work Index, the North East Yorkshire and Humberside had higher than average female unemployment. Are there any local government or business initiatives to address this? Is there anything that you're aware of locally that people can reach out to? Anyone can take this one. Feel free to jump in.
I was going to say, we might have to take this away from Matt and find out, unless Natalie, you are aware of anything from a higher education perspective.
I'm not aware of anything from a wider consortium, but obviously the source are very big on changing the demographic of our learners, and we are working really closely with schools, and most recently, getting into schools and actually having the conversations about all these other careers that are out there in schools. I have my own personal agenda to drive primary IAG, and that's where my focus is right now. But I know there's a lot of work, obviously, in secondary schools in terms of the Gatsby standards, impartial IAG, taking in alternative sectors that schools don't teach, because we have to remember education is so traditional. Even though there is a vocational element, the main focus is still on them traditional subjects: the maths, English, your science, your history, your geography, a bit of a language, whichever language it may be. And I think we have to coach young people to think in a different way in order to address all these industries, especially, the new green agenda. There's going to be an influx of engineering jobs in the coming years. But where are them engineers coming from? Because the young people do not know that these jobs are even there. So it's about working early on, as I said, I guess, at the beginning, that we have to start looking at education and seeing if we can influence education and change.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So Penny, this one is actually for you. It is if any other areas of identity came up in your stories when you were doing your case studies, e.g. women experiencing racism on the job and other things like that.
Unfortunately, there were too many stories of people being bullied in my cohort of women that I interviewed, and there was racist bullying. I think one of the really interesting and surprising things that came out of the data when people were narrating to me what happened to them was that these events became really big positives for them, because they actually just kind of hit a kind of epiphany and thought, I'm not putting up with this. I don't even like this job. And I'm not putting up with somebody treating me like this. So actually, this is now my time to think about moving on and doing something that I've always wanted to do. So it was depressing, but actually it could be a real trigger for these women to move on to something that they actually found at the end of the day more fulfilling. But it is depressing, the amount of bullying that went on. And I think I didn't interview one woman who didn't have some experience of it. And although it often ended up being quite liberating, there were mental health connotations right along the line from it. From people who had complete breakdowns, who had to leave jobs because they couldn't cope with it. And again, I just find that actually just unacceptable, really unacceptable.
Yes, absolutely. And, it is something that businesses as well as individuals should try and tackle when they can. If you see bullying, you should speak up about it and you should try and stop it where you can. Absolutely, if it's safe to do so. So we're going to move on to a final question, which I'm going to slightly change. So it says, do you have a strategy to work towards navigating the accession of progression routes for the women, in particular when considering an increase in junior male employees? So I'm just going to change that slightly to, what would be your one tip to do this? If you had to give one line, one sentence that you think will help do this, what would it be? If we start with, I'm going to pick on someone, Natalie.
I knew you'd ask me first. Okay, one tip, resilience. I think for everyone to build up that toolkit that when you get told no, you don't accept that no and you keep pushing. Yeah.
That's a great one. And Tracy?
So if this is, I think there's something about sponsorship. So for me, if I think about my career, the greatest thing that I had was really great sponsorship. So for me, it's back to, if you can find a sponsor, somebody you can connect with and you can work with them and they can help you move up, that's great. And if you've had the privilege of having a sponsor, be a sponsor to someone else, because that's how we build that community. That's how we build the role models. And that's how we can help people really start to shift the dial in terms of how we get there.
Brilliant. And Dr. Penny?
Yeah, I agree with what Tracy and Natalie have said. Get support, that's one thing. But another thing is make sure that you don't underestimate what you've achieved. Make a note all the time of what you've done, and not to, develop a great big head and think you're marvellous, but just to actually accurately log what you are achieving. Yes.
Are there any closing comments that you wanted to make, Sarah, in terms of a sums up of today's session?
Yes, thank you, Natasha. Just a massive thank you to the panelists. I think what we can see and recognize is that there's still a long way to go with addressing the gender pay gap, but we really hope that, you found the discussion useful to help you empower yourself and to share this and educate your managers, yourself, your juniors, your teams. There is a CMI toolkit on the gender pay gap on the CMI website. Feel free, and there'll be more information on the Northeast Yorkshire and Humberside pages on LinkedIn. So it would be interesting to get any feedback. We'd really appreciate that. I know Natasha's put in a link. So it would be good to hear more from you. I know we didn't take all the questions, but thank you for listening to us, and have a good evening.
So that's it for today's session. Thank you to everyone who joined us, and thank you, Sarah, Dr. Penny, Natalie, and Tracy for your insights and expertise. Don't forget, if you're a member of CMI, you can log into Management Direct using the link in the live chat, and you can find a wide range of exclusive and practical development resources and much more. We also have things like our Blueprint for Balance and our advice on the gender pay gap. And if you're not yet a member or subscriber, you can join our community via the link that's in the live chat to gain full access to our Management Direct portal. You can also sign up to the free CMI newsletter for the latest trends and tips for managers and leaders. So thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening.